Good afternoon. I'm Dana Joya. I'm the director of the Harmon Eisner Program in the Arts at the Aspen Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to DuPont Circle for another of our lunchtime fora. We are delighted today to have as a guest Kati Marton, who I'm sure is known to you, though I suspect maybe known to you in different ways because her career is extremely varied. She was a reporter for ABC News and NPR. She's the former chairwoman of the International Women's Health Coalition and the Committee to Protect Journalists. She is also the author of a number of books, a biography of Wallenberg, a book on presidential marriages, a book which is interestingly related to the new book that we're talking today called The Great Escape, 9 Jews Who Fled Hitler and Changed the World. I read that in Hungary it was called 9 Hungarians who fled Hitler and changed the world for marketing purposes. And she's the winner of numerous awards, including the George Foster Peabody Award. And my favorite of the awards is the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary.
I should have worn that.
Which sounds very impressive. And she is also a finalist for this year's National Book Critics Circle Award. And so we're hoping we can add that to her resume soon. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And
I'm delighted.
I want to begin, though, by accusing you of misrepresentation. I mean, the book...
Before I even introduce myself.
The book is a family memoir, but it's also a kind of Cold War thriller. Equally. I mean, you could have called it The Family Who Came In From the Cold. And it's an extraordinarily interesting story because you're telling the story of your parents who, and we'll get into this in a second, who survived the Holocaust and the Nazis, only to encounter, the communists and the Cold War. But there's also really the story of essentially Cold War espionage. And whether you're in Budapest or Bethesda, there's spying, going on in this book. Yes. And then finally, and this was particularly interesting, it is in a personal way, it's a very compact history of Cold War Hungary, which was the first country to really rise against the Soviet bloc with tragic consequences. And I wanted, if it's okay with you,
Sure.
to sort of explore, each of these areas. Let's start towards the beginning of the book, which is your parents survived Hitler, not your grandparents, but your parents survived Hitler. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. But first, let me just say hello to so many dear friends and thank you for tearing yourselves away from the more exciting show down the street at the Healthcare Summit. I'm just amazed that you were able to do so. In fact, I'm even more amazed how many people weren't able to do so. Anyway, I'm just delighted to be here. It's a great honor for me to participate in this well-known forum. I am. It also, quite frankly, played well into our personal hand because it gave me an opportunity to see Richard, who I don't see as often as I would like, who yesterday bought me a very expensive lunch in the State Department cafeteria, and today has honored me with his presence here.
But
I will.
Let me interject here.
Yeah.
I think, and maybe I'm being bold here, I think we could match the Healthcare Summit thrill by thrill today. I don't think we have anything to fear in terms of entertainment value, for today.
So back to
the grim mid-20th century.
Yeah, and actually, Dana, I love your characterization of the book as a Cold War thriller because let me just say at the outset, I had dual motives in writing this book. Number one, I wanted finally to solve the great mystery of my childhood, which was why, after barely surviving the Nazi era, did my parents then immediately sign up with the new enemy in the Cold War, the United States. And they did that by becoming the last independent media behind the Iron Curtain. My father was the Associated Press correspondent, my mother the United Press correspondent. You can imagine what a harmonious household that was. Interestingly enough, as a side note, one of the many things that the secret police file, which forms the core of Enemies of the People, one of the many secrets it divulged was that, in fact, the AP correspondent, my father, was filing for both, and that my mother, bless her heart, she was a beautiful and very witty woman. She was no journalist. My father was writing copy for both. I don't think that AP and UPI were aware of this fact, but thanks to the secret police file, I am now.
Hungary had no Sherman Antitrust Act.
But it did have a treacherous secret police which rivaled the Stasi in its near total penetration of every aspect of daily life in Hungary. And what the files, and I'm proud to tell you that the Marton family files were among the biggest in the archives. And I can tell you that was a terrifying fact for me to assimilate when I sat in the antechamber of the archives with the head of the archives and watched clerks in white coats, this is a leftover from commie days, wheeling in shopping carts full of the Marton family files. And the head archivist turned to me and said, "Yes, it's one of our biggest files. Like, congratulations, you've hit the jackpot." I mean, that was terrifying, and I could hardly wait to dive into those files, which I translated, and that does form the core of the book. But my second motive, so I wanted to penetrate that mystery, which there were huge pieces of my personal history that had been glossed over by my extremely forward-looking parents, who, once we arrived to the United States, they really just wanted to Americanize. They wanted us children to turn our backs on our history, but they were cursed with a writer in the family and writers need to know their history. So that was my first motive. My second one, frankly, is that I think history is too important to be left to scholars. Why do I feel that way? Because obviously we need the historian's perspective on events, but we also need the human substance of history. We need to hear from live witnesses, from participants, and from victims of these of the twin cataclysms of the 20th century, fascism and communism. And so I really moved fast to get at people who in some way lived through this period, who knew my parents, whether journalists or diplomats, or even informers. And it turned out that there were far more informers in our lives than my parents, who both passed away a few years ago, realized. Pretty much everyone in our inner circle, friends and perhaps the most treacherous of all, our French nanny, who in fact turned out to have been a full-time agent, which is belated vindication for me since I never liked her. And I couldn't get my parents' attention on that because they thought I didn't like her because I was a bad kid, and she was much tougher on me than on my well-behaved older sister. So I had no credibility there. And I'm really sorry my parents didn't live to read these files, which completely vindicate me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Now,
yes.
let's actually talk about your parents. I mean, your parents are hardly the couple that would come to mind in discussing Soviet-era Budapest. When your father wore, tailored suits, handmade shoes, he must have driven the only Studebaker in all of
Absolutely.
the Republic of Hungary.
White Studebaker convertible in a country where there were only 2,000 private cars. I mean, can you imagine calling more attention to yourself? But there was something, you know, my parents were young. They were in their 30s. They had barely, as we mentioned, survived the Nazis. They wanted to live. These were, you know, the portraits that emerge of my parents are very mixed but very human. And I'm glad, frankly, that I didn't start on this journey when I was a far more judgmental person in my 20s or 30s, because I think I would have had much more outrage about some of their behavior than I do now. Now I just feel, as a result of these files. In fact, I was briefly tempted to dedicate the book to the Hungarian secret police, and then Richard said, "Nah, I don't think you should do that. Irony doesn't do that well in black and white." So,
but they really were sort of figures that, you know, would have been more typical of fin de siècle Vienna. I mean,
yes.
Very haute bourgeois, cosmopolitan, bon vivants.
Yes, they loved the good life.
Yeah,
Yes. They were the best dressed people in Budapest, I'm happy to proud to say.
Which led them into what is a remarkable balancing act,
Yes.
Essentially to stay out of prison.
Yes.
Now, you know, the interesting thing about this book, and you already talked about it a little bit, is that it's a country in which absolutely everyone was spying on everyone else. I mean, it gets to the point where there's only 3 foreign correspondents in Hungary: your parents and a spy.
And a guy, and a guy who was in his job to report on my mother and father.
I mean, one of the most interesting things about this, it's the most it really out la carré, is this notion of an informant police state, and you evoke that so beautifully. How did you?
Thank you.
How much of that did you remember, and how much of that did you actually reconstitute from these shopping carts full of AVO files?
Well, certainly the files jogged my memory as I was translating, and it was sometimes a painful process because some of the revelations were upsetting. I always knew that my parents spent a portion of my childhood in prison. 2 years in my father's case, a year in my mother's. But I thought that seemed like a fairly, one day in jail is too long, but that seemed like a fairly brief period in their long lives. But in fact, what emerged was that they were in a larger prison for 20 years. And that their every step was followed, their every letter opened, their every conversation recorded, and they had no private lives. And even in their cells, once they were arrested, and this I don't think they realized, their cellmates were informing on them. So that, for example, when my father, who was arrested before my mother, and didn't know that my mother was already in the same maximum security fort as he was, tried to smuggle a letter out to her, a letter that he wrote on cigarette paper using the stub of a pencil, and gave it to his cellmate who was about to be released, and said, get this to my wife, and another letter with it to the American ambassador asking for America to mobilize on his behalf. That letter went straight to his interrogating major's desk, and resulted in my father then being thrown in solitary. So they had zero privacy. But of course, in one instance, the fact that my father's cellmate and my mother's was an agent saved his life because and here's another upsetting thing for their daughter to have discovered: my father twice tried to commit suicide because they broke him. Enhanced interrogation, we call it today.
And this was during the humane period of Hungarian communist legal procedure.
Yes, it was. But this was the final, although Stalin was long dead, this was the final kick of Stalinism in Hungary. There was a particularly vicious Stalinist thug named Rákosi somebody that even Le Carré couldn't invent. He was really a grotesque figure out of Grimm's fairy tale. And he really had it in for my parents, who were, and he was the one who was building this file. I mean, you may well ask, why did they get away with working for the West and being so flagrantly pro-Western, going once a week openly into the American embassy at a time when nobody went near that place with the stars and stripes and the Marines out front. They got away with it because Rákosi, their sort of bête noire, had them in mind for something big and was building the file until the day when they had the key evidence, which, again, shockingly, the files reveal came from an American.
Yeah.
Again, a Le Carré twist, the American who was being blackmailed into
that was true. The person that put them in prison was an American military attaché.
Yes.
But one of the admirable things about your parents is that separately, both under rather brutal interrogation, neither of them made any, implicated any Hungarian citizen, made any false claim whatsoever.
That was, of course, my greatest fear, and the thing that many Hungarians warned me about was, don't do this. You're opening a Pandora's box. These files always turn up disturbing things, and your parents are no longer around to be able to explain why they did. I mean, obviously, my biggest fear was that my beloved and revered parents would have incriminated other Hungarians, as so many had. And when I found that piece of paper which said from his interrogator that Marton has not compromised or implicated another Hungarian, that was the moment when the clouds parted, and I knew that whatever else came out in the files, I was in effect home free because my memory of my parents will not have been disturbed by something horrible like that.
Well, now, you're talking about the book as a way of discovering, about your parents' history, those things they didn't share with you. But you were raised in Hungary from a Jewish family as a Roman Catholic.
Right.
And so even your childhood was, as you say, your parents were forward thinking. Your parents were trying to create a life which would free them from the traps of history.
Yes. This fact of my background, which I discovered when I was researching my first book, which, as Dana mentioned, was a biography of Raoul Wallenberg. And in the course of an interview with someone whom Wallenberg saved, she just very matter-of-factly said, of course, Wallenberg arrived too late for your grandparents, who had been in the first transport to Auschwitz. And that was a bolt out of the blue for me, because I was raised as a Roman Catholic, and this was, it turns out, a rather common phenomenon among Hungarians to so completely wall off the past from the post-Holocaust generation, my generation, because those people, my parents included, were really, as Arthur Kessler called them, the internally bruised survivors of Europe's greatest cataclysm, and never recovered. They were in post-traumatic shock. They never recovered, and they never believed that it would not come to pass again, because they were so marked by the speed with which a civil society, a Hungarian cultured society, could turn on its own.
So as a little girl in school, you had the life that you thought was yours, but on your official papers you were, sort of certified as a Jew, as a class enemy, were you not?
No. My official papers, and actually my parents' official papers, because you have to go back 2 generations in my family's case too, because my parents were already they converted to Christianity when they were 19, each on their own. My siblings and I were baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. But the communists weren't interested in that. Every single document referring to my parents refers to them as Andrei Marton of bourgeois background, Ilona Marton of bourgeois background. So again, they were on the wrong side of history, but this time it was for their class background. With the communists, it was the class thing. With the fascists,
wasn't there like 6 classifications for students in schools?
Yes,
Peasant,
and I was
labor.
in the lowest.
You were a class enemy.
Which meant that my highest aspiration in life probably would have been as a baker. I don't think I would have done very well.
So, after when the revolution breaks out in Hungary, and there's a month where sheer chaos is there. The Hungarians, with rather bad timing, decide to do this 1 week before the presidential elections.
In Washington, yes, Eisenhower versus Stevenson.
Yeah, and so the United States does not respond, and your parents end up in the American embassy through a series of lucky accidents. And the only other guest at the American embassy is Cardinal Mincenty.
Mincenty was the only other Hungarian given shelter during the revolution. And this is a rather dramatic passage in the book where the Russians have come back in. My parents are with all their colleagues because the Western media have arrived in force, and suddenly and we're all huddled in a hotel, and the pounding gunfire in the backdrop. This is one of my most vivid childhood memories. And suddenly all the Western journalists are rushing to telephones, calling their embassies, asking for sanctuary. And the 4 of us, my mother, father, and my sister and I, are kind of standing there. And my parents know that they're done for because whereas the charges against them before were trumped up, now they were really covered in guilt. In my mother's case, my mother helped to organize a general strike after the revolution. In my father's case, he was the one who got most of the news out about the revolution, including front page reporting on the New York Times, something that he was extremely proud of as a wire service man, to get his byline on the front page of the New York Times. But he was the one who had the daily reporting. So they had, when the Russians came back with Janos Kadar as the newly installed puppet, my parents had very serious reason to be afraid. And so it was their colleagues, their fellow journalists, and this I found in one of those dry tomes that the State Department puts out, the Foreign Relations of the United States. They put out these annual leather-bound tomes, and there it all was. How, another mystery solved. How did we get sanctuary in the American Embassy, the only Hungarian family to do so? And it was because those journalists were putting pressure on the newly arrived American ambassador, saying you cannot leave the Martons, who have just come out of jail for being friends of America. You cannot leave them out in the cold. And there's this back and forth chatter between the ambassador and the State Department, and then 3 very laconic words come across the teletype: "Leave to your judgment," from Richard Murphy, the undersecretary. And those 3 words meant we were in from the cold, because there was no way that the ambassador wasn't going to say, let them in. And so for 10 days, my parents and sister and I slept on a Persian carpet in the basement of the embassy with the World Press Corps and the Cardinal, who was you may not know any longer, but he was a tremendous figure in the Cold War, figure of resistance, akin to Karol Wojtyła, who subsequently became Pope. And he stayed in the embassy. He never
for
15 years.
Never left Hungary.
Yeah.
And stayed there for 15 years.
Yeah, but during those days that we shared the shelter of the American embassy cellar with him, he, since we were the only Hungarians there, he would say mass to my sister and mother and me, and saying that you represent the children and the women of Hungary. I found him to be a very unsympathetic character. He had a just very dour, very dark. He had a charming aide who a priest.
Yeah, Monsignor, yeah.
Yeah, Monsignor, yes, who taught us to make houses out of toothpicks for endless hours. So I have fond memories of that Monsignor.
So finally, through much difficulty, via Vienna, via New York, you know, with some people actually working against your emigration, including your father's boss.
Yes, indeed.
You end up safe in Bethesda, where what could be more complacently American, where you're simultaneously being investigated by the FBI and trying to be recruited by the Hungarian espionage force.
This was the kind of final surprise in my research. I had by now finished translating the secret police files, and I really thought that the story would end when we were received in the United States a hero's welcome. We were kind of the perfect postcard of the refugee family, the two adorable little girls. Me, one of them. I was much more adorable then. And my mother, who was then expecting my younger brother, and fresh from communist prisons, and everywhere we went, photographers followed us, and then it turns out that the Hungarians had not given up on my parents. That in fact, as soon as my father had made a byline for himself because he became the AP's senior diplomatic correspondent. They decided that it was time to pull him back. And so they, in the Hungarian embassy here, which was not really an embassy, but really a nest of spies, their chief target were my parents. And the amount of wasted man hours that went into trying to figure out which Marton will make a better agent as they try to map out. They needed 2 hours with either my mother or my father to, quote, turn them. Because, of course, the way this works, the same way it worked in Budapest, is that they were following them around, and their modus operandi is if you under sufficiently rigorous surveillance, everybody reveals something they don't want known. So just keep at it, boys, and Marton will reveal something about himself, and then you go to work, you blackmail him, and then you need 2 hours. For years, the chatter back and forth and following my mother on her daily drive to Robert E. Peary High School in Rockville, Maryland, where she had become the best, of course, French teacher in Montgomery County. And, it just makes you want to scream when you think about how much wasted human effort went into this. And the only reason they closed the file on my parents was that the guy in charge of recruitment defected and blew the whole story he wanted a better life for his little kids. And of course told the CIA the whole thing. And so after that they had to call off and by the way, that defection was followed by the ambassador's defection. So the Hungarian embassy this was 10 years after our arrival here.
The grass was greener on the Bethesda side of the fence. But sort of my final question, which is that this book is extraordinary for precisely the reason you talk about it. It's history seen from a personal point of view. What makes it bearable is that it ends happily. It's these things that these people go through these. The god-awful stretch of history where so many people are working for their destruction, and it has a happy ending.
Yes, it does.
And how few stories from this era,
Yes.
can have that. So I think that's one of the things that makes this book, gives it a special aura, of that the world is not, doesn't always have to turn out so badly.
Yeah. Would it be okay, Dana, if I could just read a very short
Please. Why don't we,
passage before, and then I'd love to hear your questions, just to give you a flavor of the book, which is a kind of an odd amalgam of personal and intimate memoir and documentation, police files. And I just want to read you, just to plunge you into the narrative, a brief section that, if I can find it, that I call The End of Childhood. I believe it's a page. Because indeed it was the end of my childhood. And by the way, many of the photographs that you will see in the book also tumbled out of the files, including my artwork, which, believe me, was not worth saving. So, February 25, 1955, the overhead light in the room I shared with my older sister snapped on. My mother, a ghostly figure, hovered over our beds. "Children," she whispered. I lifted my head up for an instant before dropping back on my pillow. "You have to get up. They need to search your room." Her voice, urgent and weary, was about to break. "Now." I could just about see who they were, shadowy figures, 5 or 6 of them, forming a dark mass in the corner. Behind them, with their arms folded, stood Madame, the vile French nanny that I spoke about earlier. Madame and Mrs. Priegel. Mrs. Priegel was the concierge in our apartment who was also informing. Madame and Mrs. Priegel, witnesses required by law for such operations. "Get into our bed," my mother said. As we slowly awoke, one of the searchers moved in. Like a hunter stalking big game, he sank his knife into our beat-up, stuffed rocking horse. Straw spilled out of my oldest possession as my sister and I ran to the room next door and dove into our parents' bed. We were too dazed to ask where Papa was. Or did we know somehow? Elvitték, Hungarian for "they took him away," was a word I often heard as a child. I did not understand where people were taken to, just that they were gone, and not much more was said. So now my father had been elvitték, taken away. Now we flash forward 4 months because the secret police in its humanity gave my mother 4 months to figure out what to do with her daughters, Kati, age 6, Julia, age 8. So now, it is 4 months later. In the late afternoon of June 23rd, our doorbell rang. Entirely absorbed in my long-awaited play date with Zsuzsi Kalmár, the older girl next door, I waited for my mother to answer the door. Zsuzsi and I were cutting up an old dress of my mother's, which we planned to turn into doll clothes. It was not by chance that Zsuzsi had chosen that afternoon to visit me. We only learned much later that she had been enlisted to play a small part in my mother's arrest, keeping me occupied during its smooth execution. At the time, I was excited to have this serious older girl's company and reluctant to get up and answer the door. After the second ring, I did. 3 men in workers' overalls peered down at me. "We came about the meter," one of them lied. "Your mother had rung. Please get her." I had a feeling they weren't who they said they were. Even to a child's eyes, these men did not belong in those 2 clean overalls. But I was eager to return to Zsuzsi. Now, I wonder, what did it feel like for those secret policemen to be masquerading for a little girl? Did they feel anything at all? Were they the fathers of little girls? "Mama," I called out, but by the time she emerged from behind her closed door, I had already returned to my room and to Zsuzsi. When, sometime later, the apartment seemed strangely quiet, I peered out. "Mama," I called. "Mama," no answer. The apartment was empty. I had never before been alone in a place that just months before housed 3 generations. My grandparents, my parents, and us children. I had never before noticed how the floorboards in the dark foyer creaked. As I rushed from room to empty room, I was aware of my heart pumping for the first time in my life. My mother was gone. How could she have left without calling out my name, without kissing me? Crying out and calling Mama, I ran down the 3 flights of stairs that led to the street. My sister was sitting on the curb, crying, her bicycle lying next to her. She had seen the men in overalls holding our mother above the elbows, shove her into the back of a Mercedes. But the car had pulled away before my sister could get off her bike. So we sat there, the two of us, and waited. For the first time in our lives, there was no one to comfort us. And I really have no memory of what happened next. Well, what happened next was that an American diplomat whose residence was next door to ours drove up and saw these two miserable little kids sitting there and tried to persuade us to get in his station wagon and go with him to the American embassy. But I do remember that I had made up my stubborn little mind that I was not moving from that corner from where both my parents had been taken. So he could not persuade us. But here's the payoff for moving as fast as I did on this research. I found that gentleman. And he was able to, living in Carmel, California, retired Foreign Service officer, and he was able to pick up the story from that point. and that is how I was able to. You ask how my memory could, since I was 6 years old when these dramatic things unfolded, how I was able to piece together the larger story. Well, it was because I was able to find survivors and witnesses to these dramatic events. And of course, one of my most dramatic confrontations was with the Hungarian agent who had been sent here to Washington to recruit my father. And he too I found in Budapest, living in extremely dignified retirement. And I only refer to him by his code name, but tomorrow I fly to Budapest for the Hungarian publication of Enemies of the People, and I know that the Hungarians will figure out who he is. And so it's going to be a rather dramatic book launch in Budapest, which I'm happy to say my daughter is accompanying me. She says, "Mom, I got your back." So I'm well positioned to take whatever the Hungarians will dish out for me.
Well, before you get on that plane, let's take a few questions
Yes,
from
I'd
the
be
audience.
very happy to.
Now we have 2 microphones there, so you just raise your hand, and one of our traveling interlocutors will hand you a microphone, and we'll begin the questions. Does anyone like to begin?
Martin. Mr. Ambassador Indig.
Martin Indig from the Brookings Institution. Kati, as you know, I love the book.
Thank you.
And one of the most fascinating things about it, kind of horrifying, is the horror that you went through in this journey of discovery. But one thing which you expressed dismay about, and I wonder whether you would elaborate a little bit about it, was the fact that your father not only flaunted this lifestyle, bourgeois lifestyle,
Yes.
as the communists would say, but he also flaunted his relationship with the United States.
Yes.
I mean, he was, by your account, going to the embassy constantly, and not just partying there, but actually providing information. And
Yes.
one of the most critical things that you expressed some anger with him about was that he took a document and actually gave it to him. So what was going on there between him and us?
Well, yes, Ambassador Indig raises a key question, and that is, was my father guilty, in fact, of espionage, which is what he was convicted of and originally sentenced to 23 years for being a CIA agent. And he confessed to that. He confessed to that under duress. But he was not a spy. But he was not a nonpartisan reporter covering the Cold War. He felt that in the Cold War there was a right side and a wrong side, and the Americans were the right side. And as a Hungarian, he took unbelievable risks to try to support the American side by feeding information to the ambassador, with whom he had a very close friendship. And frankly, I was appalled at the risks he took. I know reporters like that. I don't think they make very good parents or husbands. I adore my parents, but they are not my role models for parenting, because not just one, but both of them were in such a compromised position. And my mother, I quote from my mother's journal where she says, you know, we stayed awake all night whispering about what will happen to the little girls when we're arrested. They lived in full knowledge that eventually they would be arrested. So this to me is pretty unacceptable behavior. And this is what I mean, that they emerge as Richard, can you please stop talking? If you have a question, I'll ask it. Would you like to come up here, sit next to the teacher? It's the only way to deal with the guy. Smoke him out. See, I lost my train of thought. Martin had such a good question. No,
you went from complaining about parents to complaining about husbands.
You're right, in one seamless transition.
Next question.
Yes. Is that enough? Yeah. You better have a good question now. Rick. Yeah.
Frederick Smith. Katya, listening to you talking about the system of informers and the culture of informing, I'm taken back to Moscow, of course, in the 1970s. And people like your parents knew that they were surrounded by informers.
Yes.
But they also managed somehow, at least in my experience in Moscow, to find some people, maybe only one or two or three, with whom they would sit up at night and secretly read Solzhenitsyn's forbidden novels and that kind of thing. I'm just wondering whether or not there were any patches of blue in all those storm clouds in Hungary. Were there any human relations that you could find that were not incriminated in those voluminous files of the AVO?
I'm sad to tell you that there weren't, and my parents basically had only each other. So much so that, among Hungarians that is, so much so that, remember I said that the secret police gave my mother 4 months to figure out what to do with us? Well, she laid very careful plans. Her best friend, married to an eminent scientist, no children, very wealthy. She offered to look after my sister and me. When the secret police took us to this lady's villa, she opened the door this much. She saw us, and behind us the agents, and her, in a very trembling voice, she said, "Where should I send packages for the little girls?" And that was the full extent of her commitment to her best friend, because fear is such a powerful motive, which frankly, Rick, makes my parents even more astonishing in retrospect. Astonishing for their courage, but also for their recklessness. But the recklessness, it was mitigated by the fact that they were really doing what they believed in. They felt that the world had to know what was going on in this forgotten corner of this gray and undifferentiated mass which had become Eastern Europe. So I have now read all the transcripts of their report from 1947 to their arrest in 1955, and they covered every single important story, including tennis matches, ice skating competitions. They did everything, and they were the last voice of the free press. So they weren't just driving around in the white Studebaker convertible. They did that too. And they weren't just dressing well. They did that as well and played a lot of bridge.
And in some ways, wasn't this tight, wire walking part of their strategy, which is they had made themselves so visible.
Yes, they thought that would protect them.
They didn't feel they could be arrested without international protest, and indeed there was international protest when they were arrested.
Absolutely, and I give the New York Times full credit for that. The New York Times kept the story on its front page and even wrote editorials about the Martons. And this picture actually was from the New York Times front page. This was when they were arrested. This was first time I was in the New York Times, age 6. So I thank the New York Times for keeping, and journalists in general for keeping the story alive. And as you well know, that really can have an impact on dictators, especially once they want to improve their image and in the case of Hungary, build up tourism. Washington, under Eisenhower, banned visas to Hungary pending my parents' jailing. So that too I learned through Freedom of Information Act.
Please.
Alma.
Thank you, Kati, for sharing this part of your life with us. A quick question. Many years later, while you were researching, my name is Paolo Galli, by the way, this book, did any of these people who were spying on you and on your family and perhaps on many others, did they ever come and say, look, this is what we did. I'm plagued with guilt, racked with guilt. I mean, don't you think that a lot of these people must have felt very guilty? Did you encounter any of these people?
Well, okay, let's start with the most treacherous agent, the nanny, the French nanny. In a good career move, she is no longer with us. She was. I have traced her to Chinon in the Loire Valley, where she was born in 1890. So she was an old lady already then. So she's gone. I would have enjoyed talking to her. Her partner in crime, our concierge, also gone. The confrontation that I had with the agent was extremely interesting, and I refer you to that chapter because he was totally unapologetic, and therefore. I really don't mind if he's now outed, as he will be. The secret policemen, are mostly gone or frankly, I don't care, what happens to them. I was not out for vengeance or blood here. What's really important, and for this reason I'm really happy that the Hungarians are giving it a very big rollout next week, the best Hungarian publisher, and events all week related to the book. Because the Hungarians, unlike the Germans, have not really have really tiptoed around their pretty awful history with both the Nazis and the communists. Their truth and reconciliation are not Hungary's favorite words. So I'm hoping that this will encourage.
There may be no words for this in the Finno-Ugric alphabet.
Oh, it's
Next
a very rich language, I'm sure.
The question, please.
My name is Deborah Sachs. You've written this as an adult. When you were a child and living through this, when is it that you realized that your childhood was not like every other child, such as like children who grew up during the war?
Yeah.
When they talk about things like bombs were dropping, these things were normal to them in Europe. When did you realize that what you were living through wasn't normal?
From my earliest memory was of a little kid caught between two worlds. The home that my parents created was a Western oasis. We had copies of Life magazine and National Geographic on our coffee table. As Dana said, our clothes were Western because Western diplomats and journalists kept us furnished with, cloths that would be made into beautiful things for us. And I stood out in nursery school because I wore little patent leather Mary Janes, which were my proudest possession, the hand-me-downs of a diplomatic kid. Kids do want to pass unnoticed, and so I tried as best I could to navigate between those two worlds. I probably would have made a very fine CIA agent had I chosen that course, because I did learn early on to, I sang the communist marching songs in the playground, and then I'd go home and be what I thought was expected of me at home. Across the hall from us lived a prominent communist family, and whose daughter was the one who was sent to keep me occupied during my mother's arrest. And I do remember going into their home and seeing a huge portrait of Stalin lighting his pipe. And I had only seen that kind of thing in school and in the post office, and thinking, wow, they must be related to the big guy. So I'm going to be really nice here. And then I remember going back to our apartment and thinking, my mother really doesn't dress appropriatly for this country. And how little kids have instincts, and thinking, the red nail polish and the Scottish kilt that she wears, everything about her seemed, I wanted to say, Mom, what are you thinking? When everybody else is wearing one of two outfits from the State Department store, but I don't know. I think my parents were just, there was some, what the French would call je m'en foutisme about my parents, like to the regime, and see if you can arrest us and get away with it. Well, they gambled and they lost. But there was an overly defiant and almost an arrogance.
But in the end,
about
they
them.
won.
In the end, they did.
In the end, they won. I mean, they took a huge risk, and they got
Yeah.
out.
I think
with their family.
I think their feeling was that if we are this open, this public about marching into the embassy, not tiptoeing around who they were and what they stood for, then we'll get away with it. And up to a point they did, and then they didn't. So, yes.
There was a movie about 4 years
But
ago.
let's get the microphone so we can hear it on tape too.
Rosemary Reed, DC Historical Society. There was a movie about 4 years ago. I think it was
The
Vienna.
Lives of Others.
Stasi, and he ends
Yes.
up with there was
Great-
a
great film.
mailman is the informer. The one who worked, he was a mailman. He
Yeah.
was the informer. Is that his name?
Yeah, I'm
It's
sure many of you
amazing.
saw The Lives of
Yeah,
Others. It's
it
a
was
wonderful.
amazing.
If you haven't, do.
Yeah, very
Yes, yes. No, actually, seeing that film was yes. That was a spur for me, because I thought, wow, I wonder what our file looks like, and that was one of my initial motives. Well,
Let's take one last question. I think there's over here, then we'll.
It's really a privilege to be here.
Wait, with the microphone.
My name is Priscilla Lujan, and I'm the head librarian at the Foreign Service Institute. And it's quite a privilege to be here, and I'm thinking
you.
about your comment, don't just leave history to the scholars. And at the same time thinking, well, I took some annual leave to come here, but what about colleagues who deserve to listen to this? I could request it as a book in our library and for the Bunch Library.
Nothing would please me more.
So I would have to get permission
Yeah.
to invite you, but
Oh,
perhaps
please.
you could help me with that.
I would be delighted. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well,
Thank you so much for your attention.
yeah. Thank you all for coming.